Christianity more than in any other system of thought. And I'm thinking about visiting yesterday First Presbyterian Church in downtown Chattanooga and taking part in worship that yesterday morning and hearing about the mission effort. The sermon was by Hugh Palmer, an Englishman, and he spoke very, very well about Paul's admonition to be like other people, so as to win them to the truth of the gospel. The gospel, of course, being a report, even an argument about the atoning death of the Lord Jesus Christ for His people, for sinners on the cross, followed 3 days later by the emptying of the tomb. He rose from the dead, bodily rose from the dead. And in the Christian understanding of that world-changing event, sits right now in His body at the right hand of God the Father, of course, who is a spirit and does not have a body as we do, but Jesus does, and that is the most remarkable claim in Christianity, that of the bodily resurrection. Christ rose from the dead in the body in which He lived, and in which he gave His life, and He perished on behalf of His children. They were the children of Israel initially, and now people from every tongue and tribe, every color, every race, every nation, every nationality, every history. Those are the people. Among all those people are His children, for whom He effectually died and saved them from their sins, and is giving light to the whole world, even among people who are lost souls. This morning, before I got to working for you, my listener, I did a reading in the book of Daniel about the lion's den, and I read kind of back earlier than what I was assigned to read in the handwriting on the wall, and then King Darius, who put Daniel in the lion's den after he had been smeared by his rival satraps, who who hated his perfections, who hated his virtue, and who wanted him destroyed by the king himself, by having the king pass a very vain and self-glorifying edict that only he could be worshipped and only he could receive the prayers, the people's prayers. Of course, Daniel completely disregarded that. He knew what had passed, and yet he prayed 3 times a day in the open window, not suddenly in the open window, but habitually, continuingly in the window, not changing his routine a lick, and then charged and tried and found guilty, and then consigned to the lion's den. And the story tells about defiance against the ungodly, and refusing to bow to the idol. That is what Christians have done from the beginning: is refuse to bow to the idol. And the martyrs in the early church, according to Eusebius, whose work I'm dipping my toe into his ecclesiastical history, died because they would not consent, would not give lip of consent to the idol presented by people who were increasingly hateful and angry, that they would not yield, they would not bend, would not concede the point. Yes, just recognize this non-entity, and you will live. Of course, that promise was often not kept. So those who turned their back on God still were thrown to the lions, still burned alive, or tortured in unspeakable ways, and then consumed by the burning hot plate, or the starving lion. And that the whole story of mankind, as we're considering it here from a kind of a distant perspective, is one of overall improvement, and that is, of course, the Christian theory. The Christian argument is that that of the increase of God's government through Christ there shall be no end, and there's a promise even in the book of Daniel. There's a promise that all the nations will bow, all the nations will claim fealty to God, fear to offend him, and love him and serve him from love. Love being the great motivator, and something that Christianity promises that God gives to those who worship it. Right? God uses fear and the law and the threat, no doubt, for sure. But as you hear at First Presbyterian Church and its missions conference, you hear that God uses love. He loves his people, and he wants his people to love him back and to declare his greatness and his mercy around the world. That's the missionary enterprise, which has suffered largely in the West because of the rise of Arminianism and the arguments of J. N. Darby, widely believed in Baptist circles and elsewhere, that things are getting worse and worse, that we are in a devolution, a digression. We are not making progress, we are making regress. Things are not getting better, they are getting worse. And the martyrs, of course, are witness of the fact that it's getting better. Even though they're dying, they are so confident of being on the right side that even though they perish, they will not deny the Lord Jesus, who's saved them from their sins and gave them eternal life, and also in this life gave them the promise of victory. And that is the analysis that missionaries, many of them don't, but many of them do. The argument that we have God's promises and that He has already won. He's already won, which makes me very positive, makes me very optimistic, especially when I think of people such as Jay Hirsch, because in his case in Nashville, one part of his argument is absolutely remarkable and ignored in the Criminal Court of Appeals ruling against him, 7 pages, completely ignored the argument about standing. And the state doesn't. If Jay Hirsch, as I told him on the phone, I said, Jay, this argument has to be ignored because it is a threat to the fundamental deity of the state. The state is God. The state able to act against people as if they were criminals. Based on what? Based on what? And he is arguing that the standing argument prohibits his prosecution. The state unable to show that it has been injured by the exercise of his constitutionally guaranteed God-given inherent and unalienable rights, that being the right to bear arms and the right of property in free movement. It sounds like a lot, but he's arguing for you, my listener. He's arguing, as I like to suggest, representatively, just as Christ argued and argues the case of his children before the throne of the Father. That's the Christian analysis of the atonement, right? Christ makes atonement, paying the price of sin. Now, in Canada, Christians are facing the gun as they are elsewhere. There's a member of Parliament, Rachel Harder, who is being demonized by the Canadian political establishment. All across the country, there are efforts to target pro-life, pro-marriage conservatives, especially Christians. I think she may be a Roman Catholic. And so targeted also are so-called Jews, Muslims, and Sikhs. And we can't have anybody having an opinion which contradicts our own intolerant views, right? You cannot, if you're not tolerant of intolerance by us, then you are wicked and evil. In Ontario, for example, Premier Catherine Wynne is attempting to deflect attention from an abysmal economic record and skyrocketing hydro prices by banning peaceful protests outside abortion clinics, insinuating that pro-lifers pose a physical threat to abortion clinic staff. Her Attorney General solemnly has announced that they'd abandoned other legislation to work on the ban to ensure people are protected from people quietly praying and offering alternatives at the murder centers in Ontario. According to LifeSite News, it's also no coincidence that Trudeau's Liberals have decided to make an issue of Rachel Harder personal convictions at precisely the moment that a national uproar over a tax reform plan that would have taxed everyone but the millionaires in their own caucus was going on. In Alberta, the wildly unpopular NDP Premier Rachel Notley and her education minister David Egan have decided to attack the United Conservative Party's leadership candidate, Jason Kenney. And Jason has suggested that parents should know what their children are doing when they are away from home in the care of government employees. Notley announced that this was super cruel, indicating that she thinks Alberta parents literally pose a physical threat to their children's safety if these parents are informed of their activities. And Education Minister Egan said that he is going to work on legislation to ensure that nobody will even be allowed to tell parents what their children are doing or what clubs they have joined. Of course, that would be the queer clubs in the local public school. It is important that Christians recognize what is going on here and realize that our communities are being scapegoated in order to allow failing politicians to demonize their opponents and distract from their incompetence. There are actually far more Canadians from a wide range of cultural and religious beliefs who oppose the abortion status quo, disagree with radical sex education, and find much of the sexual ideology being pushed by Wynne, Brown, and Notley distasteful, which is why there's been a backlash in Ontario against its sex education curriculum. And that was not led by Christians, but by those of other faith backgrounds. It will be essential in the coming years, LifeSiteNews.com says, to partner with other communities who also seek to pass on their values to their children without government interference, and recognize that life itself and family are of precious and primary importance. The argument that Christianity is making is against, I would say, against the policing enterprise. I think it's important to consider this as we sometimes do here on the David Tulis program at 92.7. There's a couple of murders I want to mention to you. One in Charlotte, Mecklenburg, North Carolina, of Ruben Galindo, 29, who wanted to turn in a gun to the Charlotte Mecklenburg police, and he was shot dead. Didn't speak English too good, and as he was trying to turn in his gun, he was shot down. And then there's also the story out of Utah of Patrick Harmon, age 50. I'm looking here at a report in The Guardian, and he's shot from the back. He's shot in the back. Prosecutors in Salt Lake City have said officers are justified in killing Patrick Harmon, who was pulled over for riding a bicycle without a light and who attempted to flee when police tried to arrest him. Police are not facing charges, despite the fact that body camera footage captures Officer Clinton Fox shouting, "I'll effing shoot you," from a distance before firing 3 bullets into his back. They just murdered him flat out, says Alicia Shaw, Harmon's niece. They are lying. There's no way they were threatened by anything. He was only trying to get away. Salt Lake officials have claimed that the killing of Harmon is legal because the officers feared for their lives, even though the video released to local media shows that Harmon was not advancing toward them. Another officer said he fired his taser at the same time that Fox shot Harmon in the back. The footage shows officers handcuffing this man with blood spattered about him as he's lying face down on the ground, groaning in pain. And this is in Salt Lake City, where de-escalation techniques have been taught and progress has been shown. So training does not undermine the essentially brutal nature of policing. Policing by design is intended to be a partisanship of the finger, right? It is a work of the finger of the state, and you might say a club of the finger. The finger is the police officer pointing at you, my listener, in accusation. He is enforcing the statute against you. And in that fellowship of the finger is the district attorney. Here it is Neil Pinkston. And it is a fellowship of the finger because it is the accuser. The state is always the victim. The state is always accusing you. That's what law enforcement is. Law enforcement is not peacekeeping, right? These are separate functions. And cops, a cop is a citizen on patrol. The cop originally in common law was simply the common man. Everybody was a cop when there was a real crime. And there was no law if there was no crime. That is the common law conception that we have lost thanks to the rise of the modern welfare, surveillance, and warfare state. The district attorney's office claims that Harmon said, "I'll cut you," and turned and faced the officers with a knife as he was running. But the video doesn't show that. He was scared. All he did was run, says Adrienne Harmon, another niece who is sobbing after watching the footage for the first time. It hurts. They said, I'm going to kill you. And they shot him 3 times. He's just moaning on the ground. Now, at the beginning of the video, Harmon is tearful. He's exasperated. He's about the officers. They're trying to arrest him. The cop says he saw him ride his bicycle across all 6 road lanes and a median. And now this is really cause for concern. He didn't have the required red rear tail light. The officer said he wanted to discuss the situation with Harmon. The policeman, this is getting out of hand here, watch. The policeman eventually called for backup and determined that Harmon had an outstanding warrant for aggravated assault, according to prosecutors. He appeared emotional and distraught and told police that he was trying to take care of the warrant, Fox testified. Salt Lake City has previously received national praise for its de-escalation program. And it goes on to say the death of Harmon is another reminder. Activists said that progressive policies do not stop officers from unjustly killing Black Americans who pose no threat. That officer disregarded his de-escalation training, says Lex Scott, the local Black Lives Matter organizer. It's just brutal. How could anyone with eyes and ears believe that officer was justified? Chief Brown, Mike Brown, was apparently on the scene. No, he wasn't, but he's making a statement. We trust the process and support the decision from District Attorney Sim Gill. I believe our officers have the training and judgment and ability to make split-second decisions in dynamic situations. Notice this is just state talk. Dynamic situations, split-second decision, training, and judgment. If you read that sentence, you can't think anymore, right? And that's what it's designed to do. It's a dynamic situation. In other words, we don't know everything, and therefore we have to defend ourselves, defend our very lives, so that we officers may make it home to dinner tonight with our wives and our children. Anything that we have to do to get home safely tonight, we will do. We will brook no risk. We will, in the case of an accident, shift the risk of death not on ourselves, but we will shift it to the civilian. We will shift it to the people. We will take no risk. We can accept no risk. No, if there's any accident to be had and it ends in death, it will not be us. It will be them, the citizen. Gill added in a statement, Officer Fox reasonably believed deadly force was necessary to prevent death or serious bodily injury to himself and others, and therefore his use of deadly force was justified. Ruben Gelando, 29, in Charlotte, Mecklenburg, wanted to return a gun. He owned it, and according to his wife, Azucena Zamoraro, he decided to call police to make the arrangements to turn it in. But, dialing 911 was the last thing he did. He should not have dialed 911. He should not have dialed 911. I'm reading here from Jack Burns' account on this story, the Free Thought Project. When officers arrived, they began shouting to Galindo, manos, which means only hands in Spanish. Other officers told him to throw the gun down. Still, another officer told him to put his hands up, which he did. He had his hands up for several seconds before one officer opened fire, hitting him twice and killing him. Galindo can be heard taking his final gasping breaths as the 911 call ends. Instantly, the family, of course, goes into hysteria, screaming and crying, cursing, expressing the only emotion that they could at the horror they had just witnessed before their eyes. And, of course, what do the officers do? They aim their guns at men, at children and women. They had the guns trained on them as well. Experts and community leaders are calling the officer involved shooting. Again, that's a bit of jargon, a homicide, and understandably, they want the officers to be held accountable for their actions. They point to multiple camera angles of video footage obtained through court orders by the Charlotte Observer. Standing with Officer David Guerrera, who apparently fired the fatal shots, is Chief Kerr Putney. Chief Putney says, at some point during the contact with police, Officer Guerra perceived Galindo to be a threat. The chief said, I'm not going to second guess how officers perceive a lethal threat. Notice this respect. Respect for the officer's individual, professional. While it is clear the chief of police is standing by his officer's decision to shoot and kill Galindo, others are calling what happened to the man who called 911 for help either manslaughter or murder. And that is, of course, what it is. But we have in Tennessee, we have a ban on titles of nobility, and yet that's what we have. We have to enforce the constitutional ban in Tennessee on this title, and the statute does not reflect the Constitution on this point. Just as the anti-black, they were called Negroes at the time, the anti-Negro gun law that we have in Tennessee, which bans the carrying of any arm. It is called the Intent to Go Armed statute, and it was written against black men by the established Democrats in Tennessee, against black men only. Black men were to be disarmed arbitrarily, but that law, of course, though aimed at blacks, affects everybody, and that's why we should be very cautious of any new raising any new compulsion or coercion against any group at all. That law now hamstrings and frustrates everybody, not just black people, but white people as well. Anybody who wants to defend himself. And I think that the only defense against terrorism is the armed citizenry. That is the defense against wild violence of the kind that we've had, even with the killing of those 5 military people here in Chattanooga. If we'd had an armed citizen in the first stop of Mohammed Abdulaziz in the intersection there near the Toscano restaurant off the highway, if there had been an armed citizen, that could have ended it right there and saved the lives of 5. But we didn't have enough armed citizens in Hamilton County. There are only 15,000 concealed carry permit holders here. Not enough, anywhere near enough. So we need to have 100,000 armed concealed carry permit holders and others who carry constitutionally in our county to defend the innocent and maintain the peace. That's what has to happen. And I mentioned these cases, and also President Trump. President Trump wants there to be more enforcement against Hispanics in our country. The story in the Wall Street Journal: White House sends Congress plans for immigration enforcement. He wants more enforcement, more police abuse against innocent, non-criminal people, right? People who are here harming no one, having committed no crime, and now they're the subject of police action. Woe is us. Woe is us if we accept this and even applaud it. I think the right wing is seriously mistaken in supporting the abuse of Spanish-speaking people in our country. These people are here. They want to work. They want to be left alone. They are sometimes the only folks we can hire in businesses in Hamilton County, especially in farms in Tennessee and elsewhere. There are not reliable Caucasians. There are not reliable black people to hire. But there are reliable Hispanics who come here to work. They're the ones we need to have here working in this state. They need to be offered as examples. They are an encouragement. They should be an encouragement. They should be exemplars of the Christian work ethic, and many of them are. Probably most of them are. We don't want there to be more violence against innocent, non-criminal citizens such as them, or as against others, such as those men who lost their lives at the hands of police. David Tulis.
The Tennessee Valley's news talk leader, Nooga Radio, digital FM.